Hello class and welcome to today's lecture. Today we're going to discuss compensation and pay. Let's get started. One of the things I want to point out first before getting too deep into the lecture is the terminology total compensation. When we're discussing total compensation, we're referring to the entire set of financial expenses that a company incurs when it comes to employees. So this includes your base pay, variable pay, benefits, time off, paid time off, health care. It includes all benefits and actions that a company incurs when it comes to compensating or being financially responsible for employees. I want to also share something that many of you may or may not know. Companies typically, especially your larger companies, they'll have what's called pay grades. So depending on what the job that HR is hiring for, they will have pay grades. So there'll be a minimum salary and a maximum salary associated with that particular position. And that position will be within a certain rank within the organization. Depending on the person who's being hired, his or her experience level, they may get placed higher toward the end of the pay grade, or they have less experience and be lower in the end of the pay grade. This is helpful when it comes to negotiating for a new position that you're hiring for, or just making sure that you're capturing, from an HR perspective, the range of salaries that is acceptable for a certain position. A bit of terminology here for salary and wages. Wages refer to people who are getting paid hourly. Basically, people who are exchanging their time for some type of hourly compensation. We call those wages. Salary, on the other hand, is a fixed amount of money that a company promises to pay an employee for the work that they're doing. Now, a couple of things to note here that's different. With wages, if you work more than 40 hours, which is considered a typical work week here in America, then you'll actually get more money. And oftentimes you may get a time and a half or something like that if you're working overtime, or overtime being over 40 hours. Salary, however, doesn't matter how many hours you work, how few, or if you work more than 40 hours, you're going to get that same dollar amount every month or every biweekly in your paycheck. Equity theory states that employees compare their amount of inputs to their outputs, and this is really a ratio. So they're taking, you can think of it this way: the amount of inputs they have divided by the number of outputs that they have. Just think about that cognitively. Now, they compare that ratio to the ratio of other employees, the amount of inputs that they're putting in versus the amount of outputs that they're getting. And they're looking for what we call balance. So when we talk about compensation and pay and all those things for employees, this is a very important concept to remember. Employees are looking for balance. So maybe I'm working the same job as Peter. However, I know that my performance is not the same as Peter. I'm not putting in as much effort or as much work, and therefore I'm not producing the same results as Peter. Likewise, my pay is also less than Peter's. So I'm looking at what I'm contributing to the organization psychologically divided by what I'm receiving from the organization. And I compare that ratio, that mix, to the ratio of Peter. So Peter's working extremely hard, and his contribution to the organization is much more. Therefore, his results, his pay, is actually higher than mine. So I'm okay with that. The question we need to think about is when there's an imbalance, when that ratio doesn't work out. And you got two ways it could not work out. It could work in my favor, meaning that my ratio is higher than somebody else's. So here Peter is, for example, contributing a lot more to the organization, and he's getting paid the same amount that I am, or he's getting paid less than I am. All right, so that's a ratio that's in balance, but it's working in my favor. Then you have a ratio then that's in balance, but it's working against my favor. So here it is, I'm working harder than Peter, and I also get paid the same amount or less than Peter. So in that case, the ratio is imbalanced, but it's to my negative. Employees respond differently to each situation. If let's just take, for example, it's in balance, but it's not in my favor. So I see I'm working really hard. I've worked really hard this year. I've done a lot of extra work, and yet I got the same pay raise as everybody else in the department who put in half the amount of work that I did. As humans, we seek out consistency. We seek out balance. So what's likely to happen with that employee is that they're going to reduce the amount of input that they're getting so that that ratio now balances out with the rest of the people in the organization. Or they may go to the boss and ask for a raise or ask for a promotion or demand greater compensation in order to raise their rewards that they're getting from the organization, thereby putting the ratio back in balance. So when it comes to an out of balance equation where the employee perceives that they're receiving the short end of the stick, they may engage in any number of behaviors to correct this perceived imbalance. Some frequent behaviors are reducing the amount of work or effort absenteeism, not caring, engaging in gossip or mal talk about the manager or the organization, and even in some extreme cases, theft and sabotage. These are all typical responses when balance of contribution is off. Now, when we look at the other side, which is interesting, when the ratio is off, but it's in my favor. What we typically see employees do, because once again, we're still looking for balance, is that they'll find ways to address their cognitive dissonance. They'll say, well, I must be a more valuable employee than so and so. That justifies why I get paid more. Or the work I'm doing must be more valuable, more important to the organization than what I think it is. Therefore, this ratio, this imbalance is okay. So the interesting thing to point out here is that when the ratio is unbalanced, and if it's to the negative, employees take steps to balance it. If it's at a positive, they typically take steps to adjust how they perceive the situation in order to justify the ratio difference, thereby restoring their balance. So this is equity theory and how it relates to compensation and pay. There's another concept that we hear thrown out a lot, which is called pay equality. And I want to make sure we discuss this, pay equality versus pay equity. Pay equity says that there's a balance or a ratio. With pay equity, you could have two employees doing the same job, but they're receiving different amounts of compensation. With pay equality, it says that, look, for the same job and same work, we have to pay everybody the same amount across the board. And while on the surface this sounds good, it can lead to some very devastating impacts across the organization, particularly in American culture. For example, if one person is actually working harder than the other, but the pay and compensation is the same, you go back to the negative impacts of equity theory. You also have things like, quality of output, seniority, experience, how much effort a person is contributing. All these are good reasons to justify one person making more money than another person. So while pay equality sounds really, really good, it's actually a concept that organizations need to be very careful about implementing. Here we're going to talk about compensation philosophy. Compensation philosophy for an organization communicates information to all employees about what's valued within the organization. It enhances the likelihood of consistency in pay across the organization and helps to attract, motivate, and retain employees. There are three common compensation philosophies. There's a lot more out there, but these are the three we're going to talk about. Those are organizations that are pay laggers, those that are market payers, and those that are above market payers. So a pay lagger is someone who typically pays less than the market. As a result, they don't have the best quality employees. They have people that may be just good enough or what have you, but they don't pay as much as others, so they don't attract a higher performing employees. Market pay, these are people who are paying right in line with the marketplace. So they're attracting both some good employees and some bad employees, but they're trying to be fair. They want to make sure they're not overpaying for a job. So they're not going to attract the top quality candidates. They still can get some good candidates, but they're really more focused on being fair, a fair market value for the job and the work that they're receiving. You have others that constantly pay above market. So these are individuals that are using salary as a strategic tactic to attract the best and the brightest, to attract the best talented people that they can find. Companies like this would be Google, Intel. They consistently pay above average for their employees, and as a result, they tend to attract a lot of high performers. When it comes to determining a person's compensation or what compensation should be, there are three basic approaches here. One is a skills-based approach, the other is a competency-based approach, and then the other is market-based pay plans. So a skill-based approach, this says, look, we're going to pay employees based on the skills that they have. So we're going to look at and assess your skills, and then we're going to compensate a person based on that. If you acquire additional skills, then you may be eligible for a raise or something along those lines. Competency-based plans, now these are very structured pay systems, and they identify the competencies employees they need to master before they can receive a pay increase. So we're looking at what are the competencies you have, and if you could add on various competencies, then you're more valuable to the organization. You can get pay raises according to that. And the other is market-based plans. So this is a method where we use external information. So we may use a company like salary.com or get industry analysis reports on compensation and salary ranges for various positions. And we use that information to have a market-based compensation model for the various positions that there have been a number of laws that have been passed in relation to compensation for employees, namely the Davis-Bacon Act, the Washley Public Contract Act, and the Fair Labor Standards Act. The Fair Labor Standards Act set a minimum wage. The idea was that it was supposed to set a basic living wage for all employees, no matter what job that they were working in. Many people argue today that this minimum wage is insufficient for people to make a living, to support themselves. It's a very highly debated topic right now among our politicians. Some are arguing that the minimum wage should be raised from, I believe, $7.25 is what it may be at right now, up to $15 an hour, which constitutes what they believe to be a livable wage. Now, this would have a substantial impact on a number of organizations, as they may not be able to afford such a, to double their pay for employees that are making the minimum wage. So this would be very interesting to see how this plays out. But the basic act that was passed in 1938 was to ensure that there was a standard of living that everybody can make if they were out and willing to work a full-time job. Now, the Davis-Bacon Act similarly does the same thing, but this focuses on contractors with the U.S. government. And the Walsh-Haley Public Contract Act does the same thing to ensure that certain contractors who work with the government, pay their employees a minimum wage and overtime of 1.5 times their salary or the minimum wage for if they exceed 40 hours. Now, in the very first slide that we discussed, we talked about a number of different types of compensation. Or in the very first slide of this lecture, we discussed the concept of total compensation. And in that, I said that compensation is not just the salary that a person gets paid, but there's a number of other types of financial incentives that organizations can offer employees. Here's a short list of a few. Stock options, rewards. These could be something like a gift card or gift certificate for people who do well or have high performance in the organization. Variable pay. This could be someone who's a salesperson who has a base salary and they have a variable structure to their pay. Base salary, this refers to like that fixed salary amount that a person is going to receive, that they know they're going to receive no matter what throughout the year. And then your benefits. We talk more about benefits in module 12 and 11 in benefits. We speak more about benefits later, but benefits typically include health coverage, dental, eyes, could be college tuition reimbursement, and a number of other different types of options. We go over that more in a later lecture. I do want to spend a little bit of time to talk about stock options just to define what they are. So stock options refer to an employee who's given stock options has the option to purchase stock in the company at a fixed price. Now, the good thing about this is that, let's say the stock option you have as an employee is to buy the stock for your corporation at $50 a share. Well, you'll have typically a time period that you have to use, or that you'll have available to exercise this option. Let's say that time period is 2 years. So you could look at that stock and say, oh, the stock is at $50. I watched it for the last 6 months and now we're up to $70. I definitely want to buy the stock. And you already know going in that you're going to make a $20 profit because you're able to buy the stock at that $50 price for whatever the number of shares that were specified. Similarly, if the stock price goes down, so your option is at $50, but now the stock for your company is down at 40, well, then I don't want to buy the stock right now because I'll be losing money on that stock. And when a stock price is lower than your stock option price, we call that underwater. The stock is underwater. And as long as the stock is underwater, it's virtually worthless, stock options are. So stock options really only provide that benefit and incentive when the company is doing well. So it motivates employees to work harder to make the company more successful. That wraps it up for this lecture. If you have any questions, be sure to email me or give me a call. Thank you very much, and I'll talk to you later. Take care.